Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus. My name is Lewis Harper, editor of Airline Business, and joining me for this episode is FlightGlobal's airlines reporter for the Americas, Howard Hardee. Hi, Howard.
Hi, Lewis. Thank you.
This week, we're looking to Latin America, a really interesting airline market that you've been following closely and even visiting in recent times, Howard. Are you getting the impression that Latin American airline businesses are finishing the year strongly? And ultimately, what's driving that demand for airline seats in the region?
Yeah, I think even more generally than just this quarter, the third quarter that just wrapped up with Avianca reporting their third quarter results, we're getting the sense that Central and South American cities are on the radar for international travelers. And people who live there are traveling by air more than they used to as well. I live in the US and I just did the Panama stopover program that Copa does on my way back from the Alta conference in Lima. That program encourages you to stay in Panama for a few days when you have a layover there, like how Iceland Air does it. TAP does a similar thing in Portugal. Copa is the national airline of Panama, so they're big on promoting tourism there. And it's just a really big hub for travel in between North and South America, this growing international hub, because it happens to be situated in this kind of ideal place between the continents as well as the Caribbean. Elsewhere in the region, Bogota is seeing a lot of growth in terms of being a transit hub, though they have pretty serious infrastructure issues at the airport there. Lima, to a slightly lesser extent than Panama and Bogota, is a big hub as well. Lima has strong connections to the west coast of Mexico and the United States, and it's also a jumping off point for flights further south into deep South America. They also have their fair share of airport and policymaking problems in Lima, but it is a really important network piece for several carriers in the region. You've also got really big cities and airports in Brazil, though airport congestion there is notorious. Chile and Argentina are these airline-friendly countries that have kind of bought into the idea of air travel as an economic driver. And this isn't even mentioning, the natural features of South America that are a really big draw for international travelers, like the Amazon and the Andes and Machu Picchu and so forth. And, the data suggests that there's this growing interest in air travel from within Latin American countries themselves. A lot of the carriers are talking about this surge in first-time flyers where people are getting newly exposed to it. Some people are starting to take planes instead of buses, for instance. Those same airlines have also been talking a lot about increasing demand for international flights. We're hearing that pretty much across the board. And I believe that you've been hearing from European carriers that Latin America is viewed as a growth opportunity for long-haul flights, right, Lewis?
Yes, covering earnings calls in Europe recently, there's kind of two things they've all got in common when you hear the big network groups talking. So one is generally strong premium demand, but almost universally they mention that Latin American yields are their highest performers and that they're really encouraged by trends in connecting to that market. Specifically looking at Iberia, for example, in Spain, obviously there's a lot of connections into Latin America. It's recently talked about Madrid being the new Miami, so a really popular destination for people from the Latin American region with money to invest. So it's kind of enjoying the fruits of that in Madrid. And another example of how that's attracting airline interest is obviously Air Europa, the second biggest carrier at Madrid. Also, obviously, a big connector from Europe into Latin America. We know IAG tried to take a controlling stake in Air Europa in recent years, but failed because the remedies for that would have been too harsh. But Turkish Airlines recently is working towards being a significant investor in Air Europa now. And again, they're wanting a piece of the action in terms of being able to connect its passengers onto Latin America through Madrid. So yeah, it's a big talking point for a lot of airline groups in Europe at the moment. When we look at a lot of markets, maybe where we're based are more mature, I think it's viewed as a bit of a land of opportunity for a lot of carriers.
Yeah, and on the opposite side of the coin, we hear that a lot from Latin American carriers about the growing interest in international travel to Europe. Avianca and LATAM have been talking quite a bit about adding wide body, long haul capacity to their fleets. So that's a big area of focus. And, just taking a step back, adding this all up, it really does look like Latin America is emerging as a major growth area for the global airline industry. As you just mentioned, some airline executives will tell you that it's still an immature market with a lot of runway ahead. I think it's also worth noting that Airbus and Boeing and Embraer, they all have a big interest in selling planes to Latin American airlines. It's a strong narrow-body market in particular, and there are some opportunities for long-range narrow-bodies like the A321 XLR to open new routes in the future. So it feels like Latin America is on the upswing at a time where demand is maybe a little weaker in North America.
Yeah, and the region overall showed strong growth in the third quarter, the recent third quarter, with revenue and profits up and indicators showing capacity rising. I think when I looked at the data for the four major regions we track, Latin American capacity and traffic was significantly ahead of the other regions in terms of growth during the third quarter. And do you see a sort of a healthy airline sector in the numbers you've seen?
I do. It feels like it's a healthy airline sector in Latin America. And to some extent, you've just got to tip your cap to some of the airlines. Some of them are really well run operations. Aeromexico, for example, is one of the most on-time airlines in the world. LATAM is just kind of the juggernaut in the region, often compared to Delta. By no coincidence, they have a joint venture with Delta, and they really just rake in revenue and profits. Copa is this steady as she goes, tortoise wins the race sort of operation that is reliably profitable quarter by quarter. Copa is also fun because it's run by the oldest serving airline CEO in the world, Pedro Heilbronn. Aber Group, which owns Avianca and Gol, and perhaps Sky Airline soon, they are increasingly looking like a formidable presence in the region as well. It looks like they're going to have a really big combined fleet. And it's looking like that fleet is going to have some pretty significant long-haul capability to challenge LATAM's dominance in that regard. Plus, they're shooting for an IPO next year. So it feels like they're on this sort of new strategitic direction that is fairly ambitious. And, we haven't even mentioned the low-cost carriers in Mexico, Volaris and Viva Aerobus. They have their issues, particularly with lots of jets on the ground due to Pratt & Whitney's geared turbofan recall, getting engine work done, basically. Both have been among the hardest hit airlines in the world by the GTF recall. If you sort of take away that issue, though, with the constrained fleets and the lack of engine availability, it actually looks like Volaris and Viva are doing better than some of their low-cost counterparts in the US. Notably, demand for flights from Mexico to the USA is still down, likely due to US tariffs and rhetoric coming out of the administration. We'll see how much that demand bounces back in the next couple of quarters. And just overall, I think it's worth noting that these are not easy places to operate in Latin America. You have major capacity restraints from an airport infrastructure standpoint, just not enough gates and slots. Airlines have been clamoring for years for greater accommodations. There are high altitude airports, which can be challenging for aircraft performance. Currencies in Latin America can be volatile, which can really eat into your profits. And maybe most impressively, none of these carriers received government assistance when we were coming out of the COVID pandemic. Granted, a lot of them ended up filing for bankruptcy in the years afterward because South America maybe isn't the most airline-friendly region in terms of regulation. So that's all to say, it would be easy to have a narrative about why you're not profitable, but a lot of carriers in Latin America are doing really well, and it feels like there's momentum in the region overall.
Thanks, Howard. Yeah, it seems like I may have been mispronouncing Viva Aerobus for all the years I've been covering the industry, but so thanks for that.
I was also surprised by that one when I heard it.
So you've talked about a lot of the positives there, the opportunities, but it isn't as if all airlines in Latin America are kind of firing on all cylinders. And there are some real challenges in the region. I mean, the most obvious example would be Azul, which is currently going through Chapter 11. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Azul is one of the Brazilian carriers. They're based in Sao Paulo. Lately, they've been undergoing a restructuring process in a U.S. bankruptcy court. It was kind of odd when they filed earlier this year. I don't know that a lot of people in the industry were expecting them to do that. They had just completed a self-imposed restructuring, and it didn't really look like they were struggling from an outside perspective. But they have since said that they've had some lingering debt issues and capital structure issues since the pandemic. Also, they get sued a lot. This is something they bring up at conferences when you hear their executives speak. In Brazil, there are looser laws on bringing lawsuits against airlines for cancellations and delays. And apparently that adds up to be a pretty significant financial weight on Azul. They also had a tough go of it last year with flooding in Brazil and some currency devaluation mixed in there as well. But Azul's team says that they're making progress. They've been reworking some deals with aircraft lessors to sort of better position themselves for the future and be a bit more light and nimble moving forward. And even as they're going through Chapter 11, they've actually done pretty well performance-wise. They're also backed financially by American Airlines and United Airlines in the United States. So it's not all doom and gloom for Azul. And they say that they hope to be done with the Chapter 11 process in February.
Looking a bit further into the future, another long-term headwind facing Latin American carriers is the lack of sustainable aviation fuel. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like they have a potentially much more difficult path to cutting emissions than some of their counterparts in Europe and North America.
Yeah, so I just had a chance to sit down with Roberto Alvo, who is the CEO of LATAM Airlines at the Alta conference in Lima back in October. We talked quite a bit about that, the lack of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. He says that there are essentially 0 projects underway that could produce a significant amount of sustainable aviation fuel by the end of the decade. A couple of years back at the Alta conference, Alvo had declared that he wanted the airline group to be using 5% SAF across all of its subsidiary fleets by 2030. And now that really just doesn't look like it's even that relatively modest goal is realistic, which I think speaks to the difficulty the region would have in meeting the global net zero by 2050 target. There's also this argument that some executives make that South American carriers have contributed a relatively small amount to global emissions relative to their counterparts in North America in particular, and also Europe. And maybe it shouldn't be their burden to decarbonize their operations without government help. That's what they say, at least. Not to mention, Latin American travelers are really sensitive to high prices. It's still a developing region. So if really expensive synthetic fuel is driving up the cost of airline seats, a lot of people will literally just go take the bus. I'm not sure if the whole SAF picture makes a whole lot of sense in Latin America with no infrastructure for it and seemingly no roadmap for producing it at scale in the future.
And what else will you be watching for in the Latin American airline sector?
I'm personally curious to see if Abra Group pulls off its deal to acquire Sky Airline. Sky is a smaller outfit based in Chile, but they also have an operation in Peru. And they've kind of long been identified as a likely consolidation target. What's interesting about the deal in particular, aside from, Abra getting a little bit more market share in Chile and Peru, is that Sky has A321 XLRs on order with Airbus. And in fact, they're trying to become South America's launch customer for the type next year. So if the deal is successful and Sky becomes an Abra Group member, the group could potentially get their hands on the region's first XLRs. And it will be interesting to see how those long-range single-aisle jets are deployed in the Latin American context. And in the bigger picture, I'll be watching to see whether Abra Group really can give LATAM a run for its money as, the dominant carrier in the region. I really think of that as maybe the most interesting storyline to follow. So I'll be watching to see how their growth plan goes and if they're able to execute that IPO sometime next year.
Many thanks for your insights, Howard.
No problem, Liz. Thank you.
FlightGlobal Focus is your essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. We publish new episodes twice weekly. Join us on Friday for a concise news briefing and on Monday for an in-depth analysis covering airlines, defense, and aerospace. FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com, and more information can be found in the show notes. Listeners can also access 20% off your new subscription to Flight Global with the code FGPodcast, and terms and conditions apply. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.